We were talking last time about the romantic digression, perhaps the most famous part of the Aeneid, the romance of Dido and Aeneas. And almost as famous as the romance itself is St. Augustine's comment on the effect that it had on him when he was a young man, when he was an adolescent. He talks about his schoolboy studies of the Aeneid, and he says it's very difficult to cut in to St. Augustine because he writes in the Confessions, he writes in sentences that one page at a time. But in the middle of a sentence, he says, speaking of his school work, I was enforced to commit to memory the wanderings of I know not what Aeneas, while I forgot my own, and to bewail dead Dido because she killed herself for love, when in the meantime I, with dry eyes, endured myself dying toward thee. Oh my God, my life. And the passage goes on for 3 or 4 more pages, but that's just one clause from a semicolon to another semicolon in the middle of this long passage in Book 1 of the Confessions. Very famous and well worth not only reading but meditating, because it brings up the whole question of the relation of Christianity to the classics. This is a passage where Augustine seems to be lamenting this education, this classical education that he had, bewailing it. Why, as an adolescent, did I waste this terrible time lolling about, weeping over the death of Dido, when what I should have been doing was weeping over the death of myself, that is, my own sins, and the death of my soul. The wanderings of I know not what Aeneas, while I forgot my own. It's such a powerful passage that it stuns. Brings us up to silence. Maybe we shouldn't be reading this alone. Well, I don't think there's any question about it. Poetry is dangerous. You remember Plato brings the question up with almost equal force on the philosophical level in the Republic, and concludes that all poetry should be excluded from the ideal, from the good society, from the perfect state. And he brings a little bit back in. You need a little poetry to stir people up to be strong in battle. You need drums and fife music and march music. But aside from that, really little else. Then he concedes perhaps you need hymns to praise the gods. Well, once you begin to make those concessions, 1, 2, 3, other kinds of poetry begin to come back. But to go back to the original point, Plato starts out by saying poetry is very dangerous stuff because it is the language of sense and emotion. And that's what St. Augustine is talking about here, really. That especially at this time of life when the emotions, for the first time in the ages of man, it's in that stage of adolescence that the emotions really first flower. You can say that a child of 7 or 8 knows fear, but not really. He has a kind of childish fear, but it's all. But those emotions really, you first meet them in adolescence, and they overwhelm. They sweep away, and they can devastate. And just at that time, if you pick up a poem which reinforces those emotions, it certainly can be dangerous.
Well, both Socrates and Plato and Augustine have a lot in common. There too, as it happens. That is, these are men who are particularly sensitive to poetry
Yeah,
themselves.
poetic
They're
men.
poetic
Poetic
men.
men.
They're extremely poetic men.
Do you remember, just to interrupt, I mean, do you remember the modern Irish poet Yeats's famous remark about the difference between poetry and rhetoric? He said, out of quarrels with others, we make rhetoric. Out of quarrels with ourselves, we make poetry. And I think clearly this is a quarrel with Augustine's self.
Yeah.
And so in the case of Plato.
Yeah. Because they're so acutely aware of the tremendous impact that poetry has had on them, and bad impact, that is, an unfortunate impact that has misled them, led them astray. Plato was talking about the representation of the gods in public. That is how Homer misrepresents the gods.
Augustine brings that up too. I have a note at the top of the page here. Homer lied, and that's right out of Plato. That Homer lies. It's just a few pages further.
Yeah, but of course, as we said before, we said that Virgil himself is definitely not on the side of Dido. But as a poet, he has to put her case as well as it can be put. I mean, as Dido herself would put it, or did put it, and it is a very powerful case.
Didn't I read that quotation from the translator McHale, where he said, despite himself, Dido runs away with the poem.
Yeah. No, she's one of the most memorable.
He didn't intend that to happen. Maybe, I mean, we don't know, but there's no question that Virgil himself, the greatest master that there is, in the sense of the control of language. That is, he has much more control over his verse than Homer does. In that sense, he's the greatest master, and yet there he can't control Dido. She runs away with him.
This happens to poets all the time, and often to the very greatest of poets. That is, it happened to Shakespeare all the time.
All the time.
That is, someone like Falstaff runs away with Shakespeare's imagination.
Shakespeare never intended Falstaff to be one of the greatest men who ever lived.
Yeah.
You know?
No.
I mean, we all love Falstaff, and certainly he didn't mean that.
No, he didn't mean to make a hero out of Falstaff. And you know, if you take it as an argument, you say, well, he isn't a hero in the play, but in your imagination,
but he is.
He is. Because he stands out.
Or Don Quixote is another example with Cervantes. It's hard to know what Don Quixote intended when he wrote that.
Cervantes,
Cervantes wrote Don Quixote. It's hard to know what Cervantes intended.
It looks,
but Don Quixote becomes to us a hero.
It looks as if when he starts off, it looks as if he's setting out to ridicule.
To satirize.
But somewhere along the line, the ridicule becomes a kind of admiration.
And there's something right about it.
Yes.
That is, could it be that Dido is even greater than Virgil? Could it be that Homer is greater than Plato? That is, the matter of Homer is greater. That there are things beyond our, how does it go, undreamt of in your philosophy, a famous line, which is not in any way to reduce philosophy to anything less than it is. But there are things in life which are beyond our comprehension, and they have to do with beauty. You remember last week you and I were talking about one of our old students who's currently writing a thesis on beauty, and we were laughing at the impossibility of doing that. St. Thomas Aquinas never wrote a treatise on beauty. There isn't any definitive tract you can go to and find the answer.
He is writing on some tract, but I don't know what it is.
He deals with the question, but he has no. He has no definitive tract on it. The question comes up, but there's no place you can go to find the answer. It's one of the transcendentals. Beauty is. It's not in a category. You can't reduce it to. Is beauty an accident or a substance? It is neither one of them. It's an attribute of God himself. It's like, what do we say? The one, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Those are the four great transcendentals. And I suppose we can say nobody really knows what they are. That is
They're not attributes of God exactly.
That's a very
they're
human way of putting it.
Yeah.
They are God.
Yeah, they are.
I mean,
God,
you can predicate them absolutely. God is beauty. God is truth. He is good, and He is beauty itself. And so when we speak of Dido, as we did of Helen in the Trojan War, when we speak of Dido, we're in the presence of a mystery. She incarnates one of the mysteries of God himself. And we can't handle it. There's no category that we can put it in.
No, and the problem is that you cannot know, we cannot know the beauty of God unless except through the beauty that we know through our senses. That is, we are made up of body and soul, and we have senses. And the way that beauty comes to us, very obviously, the way that beauty comes to us is through the senses. The famous definition of Thomas Aquinas is that beauty is that which being seen pleases, that which being seen pleases. Now
you know what it is.
Now you know what it is. Obviously, he's talking about something that you see, and he means it in literal sense. That is, and he uses the word please in the sense of delight. That the same kind of delight that we have through a pleasant odor or something that tastes good or feels good. We say those things all have to do somehow with beauty, and that we as human beings, that our first experience of beauty is of things sensed as beautiful, and that all of our other knowledge of beauty, no matter what it is colored by that first knowledge that we have. And if we don't have it, well, then we'll never see it in God. We'll be crippled. A person who has no experience of beauty in the world. That is the answer, obviously. And I'm sure if you'd have asked Augustine, he'd have said the same thing. You can't prevent people from having the experience of beauty.
If you do, you prevent them from having the experience of God.
That's right. That would be impossible. And of course, he would say, well, yes, but it should be ordinate. It should be ordinate, the ordinate experience of beauty. And there's something inordinate about Dido, which is true. Mm-hmm. But it's awfully hard to.
But there's something inordinate about sense experience.
Yes, that's right.
About
that's
sight.
Right. Yes.
I mean, in themselves, the senses are not rational. Of course, the way the philosophers put it, in humans, they're acts of rational people, and therefore they participate in rationality. That is, when a man sees, he doesn't see. Sight is not something isolated from his intelligence. He sees as an intelligent being. So therefore, it is ordinate. That is, it is brought into order because he's a human being. But that has to be learned.
That's right. It's not inherent in the senses themselves.
So the senses will carry you away. They'll sweep you away, and therefore, well, that's what education is. One learns the order of the senses, and one learns the order of the emotions, and they're put under, of course, the will, and the will is put under the intellect, and we have the virtues when that happens. But in the meantime, they're hard to handle, and especially in adolescence, because that's when they first burst upon the person, and he's just not able to handle them at all. And Augustine is talking about that time of life. I wish I brought here on the table another text. I have to go rummage for it, and I can't find it in a minute. But a few weeks ago, I got a long-distance phone call from the other end of the country from a priest who, an old friend of mine, who called me up at 11 o'clock at night. And he said, you have to hear this, you have to hear this. And he read aloud a quotation from St. Augustine. he said, you would particularly like to hear this, because he knew that I talk about poetry all the time, and that this is one of our favorite themes, really, in the IHP program. We have dwelled on this over and over again, particularly when talking to religious audiences. That is, that they must never make the mistake of trying to exterminate beauty. It's a temptation of the religious to do that, and it was a temptation to Augustine here, and to Plato, for that matter. And he called me up and he said, "You have to hear this." And it was, of course, a famous passage, St. Augustine's commentary on the Gospel of John, where Augustine quotes Virgil. It's from the Georgics, I think, rather than from the Aeneid. And it goes, now I don't remember exactly because I don't have the text in front of me, but it was something like, the word trahitor is used, is drawn, is quisque trahitor sua voluptate. I might have the order of those words wrong, but each one is drawn by his own. Now the other word that he uses is voluptate, which is another word for placet, another word for pleasure. But it's a much more, even more sensuous word. Each one is drawn, trahitor. Of course, that's biblical. That's out of the Song of Songs.
Yes.
Trahe me, the bride says to the groom. And Augustine, of course, has that in mind when he quotes it. But he says, as the poet says, meaning Virgil, each, and for that matter, isn't each person, I think the quisque can be taken there as each thing, because he includes rocks and water, all the elements. Everything in the creation is drawn to God by his own pleasure. Gosh, what a breathtaking passage that is. And Augustine goes on and says, why, the pagans knew that. Are we, therefore, not to be drawn to God by our love? And he goes on that the Son is drawn to the Father by that power, by that force. The love of the Father and the Son. He gets into the intimate love of the Trinity. It's an extraordinary and very, very powerful passage. So the same Augustine that here bewails his love for Dido, at this other moment in his life draws on Virgil to make this tremendous point.
Yeah, well, we'll soon be talking about Augustine. We already are.
We already are. Yeah.
My next remark would be something like, well, that's one of the things that happens to you when you read Augustine. Augustine's not one of those writers who wins you over by arguments or by rhetoric either, so far as that's concerned. Although he was a great rhetorician, it's the force of his own love, of his own emotion, that draws you. It's that pleasure that there is simply in the reading of Augustine and participating in his experience that draws you to the truths that he himself has discovered.
If you want to prove that, just look up one of these books, and there are 1,000 of them. Just go to the library and look under under Augustine, and there are 1,000 books with titles like The Essential Thought of St. Augustine.
Platonism in the thought of.
I mean, you cannot explain to anybody what St. Augustine thought about anything. It's in the words.
Yeah.
It's exactly what we were saying about Virgil, that Augustine's thought adheres in the very words. You have to go to the text itself and just read it over and over and over again until it draws you into the mystery of what he's saying. And it's dangerous. Again, we stop and say, thank God for St. Thomas Aquinas, because if theology were founded on St. Augustine, if Catholic theology were founded on Augustine, well, as in a sense it is. What should I say? If it were only founded on Augustine, we'd all be Lutherans. We'd all be God knows what. That is, every heresy is Augustinian. And yet, Thomas Aquinas draws on Augustine. Augustine is his master. We often said the relation between St. Thomas and St. Augustine is very similar to that between Aristotle and Plato. That's one of the commonplaces of teachers use all the time, but it's true. It isn't just It's a cliche, but it's true.
No, if you go to St. Augustine with the idea of getting everything straightened out in your mind about Catholic theology, you will come away you'll come away a heretic.
You'll come away a heretic. if you try to look up answers. See, if you read that passage, oh, well, that means we shouldn't read Virgil. Actually, Augustine himself doesn't mean that. He means that at that moment. But he doesn't mean that in the...
You say, well, you have to take that into context. And you say, what context? Well, you say the context of everything. Like, oh my, the context of all of St. Augustine, who changed, who was changing all the time himself. Who was,
so we don't use St. Augustine as the measure of theology. We use St. Thomas. And we don't use poetry as the measure of our life either. We certainly... that was the mistake that the Romantics made. I suppose we could put it that way, that as romance is a wonderful thing. But romanticism, that word ism, is a very important little suffix. All isms are wrong. Ism itself is a heresy. It means to take something in isolation. I mean, there's nothing wrong with communion, but there's something wrong with communism. There's nothing wrong with romance, but there's something wrong with romanticism. The Romantic tried to isolate this poetic experience and say, as Keats, you remember, says, beauty is truth. Truth is beauty. That is all you need to know on earth. That's all you know and all you need to know. And all you need to know. Now, that is false and dangerous. It is true that truth is beauty and beauty truth. The first part of the argument is true, but the conclusion is absolutely false. That's not all you have to know. You have to know the good. You have to know the one. There are other things that you have to know, and the evil of romanticism is to take poetry as all in all. I'm afraid that we've been sort of accused of that because we dwell on the poetic experience so much.
Well, occasionally one meets a student. Someone probably rather like St. Augustine as a very young man or an adolescent who is very strongly drawn to poetry naturally. Now, that's not the common thing. In our times, that's relatively rare. Most people, I'm afraid that what happens to most people is that they're not moved by Dido at all.
Not at all. They wonder what he's talking about.
Yeah, they've never had any kind of experience like that. They really have never had the adolescent experience, and that we think that is a disaster. That's a far worse disaster than even an overdose of romanticism. But occasionally you do get the student who is a dyed-in-the-wool romantic, and when he listens to us and he reads this poetry, he is carried away, and people look at him, and very often people like that, they get to be around 30 years old, and they're still kind of mooning around. They're kind of they're like adolescents who have never taken hold of life, and then people come to us and they say, well, you're to blame for that. you fix that guy.
And we have to say, well, I suppose we are. Poetry is dangerous, so I remember we used to say in our course very early on, now this is a very dangerous course. We want to warn you. But after all, life is dangerous. Anything, God is dangerous. The truth is dangerous. You have to be willing to take a chance. You mentioned Pascal. He's great on that, taking the chance. That is, you do have to throw. There is a moment in your life, isn't there, when you do have to throw yourself into something. In a vocation, for example, in marriage, the moment of marriage is. Not only dangerous, but if you try to analyze it, it's crazy. That is, you're committing yourself to someone you really don't know that person. How could you know? Especially at the age that you do those things. It may be that if you were engaged for 50 years and had a trial marriage that you might decide at the age of 60, but then you wouldn't do it. That you would entrust yourself. But here you are, 20 years old or 25 years old, and you say, till death do us part. You really don't know what you're doing.
You take an oath. Of course, that's why you take the oath, is that you don't know what's going to happen.
But it's a faith, isn't it?
Yes.
That is, it's not the supernatural virtue of faith. It's the faith with a little f. But the theologians say of marriage that it has these different parts. It has one of which is faith, fides, and sacramentum. That is, marriage has these faculties or these constitutive parts. We say constitutive parts, and one of them is that faith in the other person, that he will be faithful. That is, that it will be monogamous. That it will be, that you can count on that. What a wonderful mystery that really is. And
well, this tends to this sort of
that's
thing.
romance. That's romance.
Yeah. This tends to frighten people, particularly now. I think.
Well, they don't get married.
People don't get married, and if you talk about children, if you start talking about children, you say, well, really, you can't control what your children are going to turn out to be. You can do your best, but you are not the person who is going to determine what they become. They may become anything.
Planned Parenthood. What a contradiction that it really is. As if you could plan it. Yeah. I mean, they mean, of course, having to do with contraception, but think about Planned Parenthood just as a phrase.
You buy books, on how to raise your children. Well, it doesn't work. And when you tell people that, they say, well, gee, maybe I won't have any children.
Okay.
If I can't control it. And, but then maybe they won't get into life either. They won't get married either. And they won't, they won't get out of bed in the morning, for that matter, because you never know what's going to happen to you when you walk through a door.
I mean, we've often said, we've used the word prerequisite. We've said, well, poetry has to come first. That is, everybody has to go through this experience of poetry before he can go on to the realm, for example, which is immediately beyond poetry. That is the realm of action. The proper time of life for poetry really is adolescence. And after that, you step onto the stage of taking some kind of action. Because poetry in itself, you talked about the 30-year-old sitting around mooning all the time. The poet doesn't act. He never does anything. Virgil exasperates people, the active type. They say, oh, he's always wringing his hands about everything, but he never does anything. There's a kind of an exasperation. The man of action always feels an exasperation with the poet, the man of reflection. And yet we would say, yes, but what a terrible thing it is to have action without any prior experience of this. That is, to try to activate 16-year-olds, get them into politics, for example, and parade up and down the street with placards. Well, that's Fagin does that. That's a corruption. That's child abuse.
Child abuse, yes.
The youth steps onto the stage of action and does something, but the adolescent has to go through this experience of poetry. There's something even misleading, however, about the use of the word prerequisite, because I think we touched on this before. It gives some people the impression that you go through it and then you're over and done with it, and that's that. And then
there's the poetic age, then there's the age of action, and you leave poetry behind once and for all.
That's not true. You have to take it with you.
Yeah. People say, oh, well, yes, I liked Keats when I was 18, 16. I liked Keats then, but now I don't. I never read that. I never think of that anymore. I've left all that behind. Now I'm a businessman. Now I'm a lawyer. I pay no attention to that. But that's false.
Oh boy, is that bad!
It's devastating.
You really would like to say to that lawyer or that businessman, you say, well, read him again. Read him now, because now is the time you need him. You're going into a trial, let's say, and here's somebody on trial for murder and so on. the best thing you could do would be to read John Keats the night before you went to that trial, with all his faults, with all his romanticism and everything else. It would be a marvelous rekindling of those fires of your adolescence, which are are not a prerequisite but an element, like oxygen. That is, you can't burn except oxygen be present, and a lawyer cannot do his work properly in the courtroom unless he still has that poetry present with him.
We've said that poetry is acts upon the senses and upon our emotions, which is true. But there is nevertheless something that we know through poetry. That is, it is, people say, cognitive in some way. It's a very low form of cognition, but nevertheless, the poet knows something. He can't explain what it is. He can't tell you what it is that he knows. He can't put it into a formula, and he's no good at definitions. But he sees something, we say. He knows something. We use the same expression about our senses, as we know things through the senses. We know things through our passions, as well as through our intellects. And so that it is a mode of knowledge. And you don't forget what you have learned through poetry, or through this. We often, I don't know if you've said it or not, through this participatory knowledge that we have of things. That is the knowledge of poetry. It's a participatory knowledge, and it's a very powerful knowledge. That's where we started on all of this, is that it's tremendously powerful. And the person who says, well, yes, I felt all of that. I read poetry when I was young, but I've gotten over it. Well, he's kidding himself. It's not true. You really can't get over it. You can try to, and you can perhaps sort of tone it down in some way, or it's a kind of forgetting, but it's always there. It's there, and it can be reawakened, and it should be.
Yes, it's. I use the word element, like the oxygen that feeds the flame. You could use the word food. It feeds. You remember the famous lines of the Duke in one of those plays. Music is the food of love. Yeah. Shakespeare's. Was that As You Like It? Or,
yeah.
Yeah, I guess it is. If music be the food of love, play on. Well, music now, poetry, music. We're using those words interchangeably. That is this realm of the muses. It's a kind of food, and as you were saying, it feeds the intellect. It's a kind of knowledge. If you make a scientific analysis of a cow, you have not exhausted the truth about the cow. The poetic view of the cow is still richer and more profound than any analysis that you'll ever be able to make of it. So that the wise scientist always brings poetry with him. And the more he learns, the more he gazes at the object. And the gazing at the object, that's the poetic act. And the more he learns, the more he gazes, not the less. And that's one of the most terrible things that's happened in the modern world, I think, is this attitude toward the object. Oh, well, now we know all about it. We put it in a book, and you don't have to look at cows anymore. All you have to do is look it up in the book. We know all about them, and we can go on from there. And what happens is you have a scientific knowledge divorced from the reality that feeds it.
That's why students so often find modern scientific treatment of the world so boring and so repulsive. They say, well, that's not the way the world is. They say, I know that the world is not like that. And so they reject all scientific knowledge, using science simply in the sense of intellectual
they become
knowledge.
romantics.
And then they become romantic hippies, and then they renounce reason, and they say, well, I don't want to know anything. I just want to feel things. Well, that's impossible. You can't just feel things.
We see this same thing. It's a frightful spectacle today in religion. the divorce of theology from poetry, the dry and the aridity of a certain kind of catechetical education drove people to this charismatic stuff, where they think they're going to find God through the feelings and through the senses. Now, they're wrong. I mean, you cannot do away with a catechism. You cannot do away with theology, but you can see why they wanted to. That is, what they had been given was something totally divorced from experience. We might put it this way: nobody should ever study St. Thomas without the Fathers. That is, without Augustine, also, and especially without the Scriptures.
Yeah, well, it's like reading modern biblical commentary
without the Bible.
Without the Bible, which is very often the case, or trying to read the Bible with the spectacles of the modern critical commentator on the Bible with nothing else. Then
turn you into a Buddhist or something. I mean, you'd say,
then you say, well, if that's what the Bible is, well, it's
I'll take up yoga or something because they are, or even drugs. That is, I'll take up experience. You hear this word all the time: experience. And I know, again, when we talk this way, that sometimes our best friends, raise their eyebrows and say, "Well, you sound like the worst kind of phony, charismatic enthusiast saying we ought to live our lives on the basis of poetry." No, we're trying to avoid that.
Yeah.
It's that very danger that we're trying to avoid by putting things in their proper order. But there is an order, and the one does come before the other. That is, you have to learn St. Augustine first before you learn St. Thomas, and you have to learn poetry before you learn theology. So we're back to Virgil again. Virgil is a prerequisite to the Christian life. And here we are talking about this romance of Dido and Aeneas, which is dangerous. That is, it's true that a young person at a certain time of life can be carried away by this temptation and think that what he ought to do is go out and have an illicit love affair. They're not married. That's true. They're not married. And boy, does Aeneas know that. And in fact, that's what he says to Dido. She says at one point, "You must stay with me. After all, you promised to marry me." And he said, "No, I didn't." He said, the fact of the matter is, I didn't. I know that I can't. I have been called by the gods, by destiny, to do some great thing. And she says, "Well, what is it?" And he says, "I don't know. It's a mystery. All I know is that I've been called to this journey that I'm on, and I don't really myself know what's at the end of it, but I have been given this definite but very vague poetic intuition." Again, the kind of thing that exasperates the lawyer and says, "Well, what precisely were you told? Or, put it in writing." Well, he says, "I don't know what it is." "You mean that you can?" She says to him, "Do you mean that you can dedicate your life to something that you don't know?" And he says, "Well, that's precisely what we're talking about. That's what love is. That's what a destiny is. That's what a mystery is. You're bound in duty to something, and you don't clearly know what it is."
And it's the fact that you are bound that really does. It's necessary that you be bound. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. Really, you'd say, "Well,
give me the evidence."
Yeah, if he were not bound by this destiny, well, he'd stay in Carthage.
Oh, he wanted to.
He'd stay there.
Yeah.
He'd say, "Well,
he loved her. He wanted to stay.
He loved her. He would want to stay. There'd be no reason for him to go on."
They had a wonderful life.
Yes.
They had a city.
This marvelous city.
They had everything they wanted. Yeah.
Just starting. It's a brand new city. It seems they have. It's a marvelous place. Remember, when he first enters that city, the first sight that he sees are the pictures, the relief carvings on the walls of the temple. there, showing the siege and the destruction of Troy. And he sees right away these people are, he says, these are really civilized people. We know that these are people who understand things. They understand that there are tears in things. So
did we talk about that?
We really didn't. We really didn't.
Most famous line of all, isn't it?
Yeah, we really didn't. And when he sees that, he says, "Well, I mean, of course, this looks." Anyone else would say, "Well, this is the place for us to stay. Here we are, homeless wanderers." But these people who made those pictures on this temple wall, they understand. They really understand. It's a very appealing thing for Aeneas.
I guess we'll have to have a digression in the middle of a digression, won't we? That is in the middle of this romance, before the romance gets started. But in the poem, but in the middle of our talk about romance, we'll certainly have to dwell for a moment, at least, on those three words, sunt lacrimae rerum, which is the theme of the poem. We talked last time about the thesis of the poem, non sponte secor. The thesis of the poem is what we've just been talking about, duty.
I think we said it was actually what we said was that it was the in the previous
thesis.
No, when we were talking about, remember we were talking about the destiny of Rome.
The destiny of Rome.
Yeah. Right.
But it is the destiny of Rome which is drawing Aeneas. In a way, that is his duty.
Yes.
It is his duty.
Yeah.
And that's the thesis of the poem. That's the what you might call the meaning of the poem. The meaning of the poem is, well, Rome must be founded, and Aeneas doesn't yet know even what that is, but he's called to do it. But then there is this other thing which we call the theme of the poem, that is that prevailing, overwhelming feeling, and that's what arises in those words.
We talked about it in the passage. No, we talked about the passage that follows that about the little the boy who dies. We said, well, there you see the theme. Yeah, but of course the greatest statement of it occurs here in the tears.
That's right. We normally don't dwell on that little passage about the boy.
No.
But it's a good example of it. It's a beautiful example, and I think that's where I had said there's nothing like that in Homer. That is, there's a profound feeling of the deepest poetic intuition in the whole poem is summed up in these words. We translate them in English, the tears of things. Sunt lacrimae rerum. He looks at those pictures,
and they're bas-reliefs, aren't they?
Right. They're painting. Well, they're colored bas-reliefs. They're wall paintings on the wall of the temple, and they depict the Trojan War. And he sees himself there, and he sees his brothers and his friends.
Well, he sees especially, of course, the saddest moment of all, the destruction of Troy. He describes in detail how Troy is finally destroyed.
And he turns to the faithful Achates, his friend, and he says, well, we've been washed up on a civilized shore. That is, the people who built this temple are good people, because they couldn't have made that art without understanding the essential truth and beauty. It's through the beauty that the truth is grasped. And what is it? Well, he says that things are essentially sad, that life is sad. That's the Virgilian theme, and gosh, it is just overwhelming. If you don't come away with anything else in your memory from Virgil, you certainly want to remember sunt lacrimae. Lacrimae are just tears. We have words in English for that again, don't we?
Lachrymose.
Lachrymose. A lachrymose person is a tearful person.
From our lacrimal glands. It means tears, literally.
Tear gland, yeah. They're kind of pejorative terms. Lachrymose is kind of
it means sentimental.
Sloppy, yeah. But the word is it tells us something about ourselves.